The sleek medical bay aboard the xenoship was quiet, save for the soft hum of machinery and the occasional beep of a monitor. Alien instruments, designed to treat dozens of species from across the galaxy, lined the walls. It was a place of healing, a place where the mysteries of the universe's vast biology were unraveled daily. But today, something was different. Zarek, a nurse from the distant planet Kylos, stood over a human patient, his large, lavender-colored hands hovering nervously above the man's body. Zarek had been trained in the medical arts for over a century. He'd treated countless species, from the fierce Threxians to the delicate Galleons. But never before had he seen anything like this. Connor Hart, a human explorer from Earth, had been brought to Zarek's care after a disastrous mission that left him gravely injured. His body was covered in burns, cuts, and bruises that would have taken weeks to heal, if not longer. Zarek had read the human medical files thoroughly. He knew how fragile the human body was. He knew that humans, with their limited regenerative abilities, typically required time, rest, and medicine to recover from even minor injuries. Yet, in front of him, Connor's wounds were already beginning to close. Not slowly, as one might expect. Not gradually, with the pace of a natural healing process. No, these injuries were healing too fast. Zarek's dark eyes widened as he watched the deep gash along Connor's abdomen disappear before his very eyes. He reached for his scanner, running it over Connor's body, analyzing the molecular structure. Impossible, Zarek muttered, his voice barely audible. The data on the screen didn't match anything he had seen before. Human DNA was designed to repair damage over time, with the aid of medical treatment, but this was different. Zarek leaned closer, examining the intricate healing process. The wounds on Connor's body were rapidly sealing up, and what puzzled Zarek even more was how there were no signs of infection or scarring. His blood pressure, normally an indicator of a serious injury, was steady. His heart rate? Remarkably normal. This wasn't just good luck or some sort of fluke. Zarek was no fool. Something was happening here, something beyond his understanding, something that made no sense at all. But why? Why was this human recovering so quickly? Was it a new form of human biology that had yet to be documented? Or was it something else? Zarek's mind raced as he recalibrated his scanner and ran tests again. Connor's injuries were healing faster than any alien species Zarek had ever encountered. But there had to be a reason, a cause. And the only way Zarek could find that out was by learning more about the human in front of him. As Zarek continued to scan Connor's body, the human stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and he groaned softly. Zarek instinctively stepped back, surprised. For a moment, he had forgotten that Connor was still unconscious. The human's eyes opened slowly, blinking at the bright lights above him. Connor's voice was weak, but steady. "Where am I?" Zarek was taken aback. He had assumed the human would be disoriented, possibly in pain. But instead, Connor seemed calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been near death. "You're aboard the xenoship," Zarek said, his voice a mix of curiosity and authority. "You were injured." Gravely. Connor's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in his surroundings. "What happened?" Zarek hesitated. The speed at which Connor was recovering was one thing, but his mental state was something entirely different. Most species would be in a panic after such an ordeal, especially when faced with a completely alien environment. But Connor appeared unfazed, even relaxed. "I'm fine," Connor said, lifting a hand weakly and inspecting it, as though trying to reassure himself. Zarek watched him closely, his mind still racing. There was no doubt about it, something was off. No one, not even a Kylonian or a Galleon, could heal this fast. It was unheard of. But what if it wasn't the body that was healing so quickly? What if it was something deeper, something Zarek couldn't measure with his scanners or technology? Something tied to the human's will to survive? Before Zarek could ponder further, Connor turned his head slightly, meeting the alien nurse's gaze. His eyes were clear, and there was an odd strength in them, strength that went beyond the physical. Zarek felt something stir in him, an emotion he wasn't accustomed to. Admiration. Respect. Something about Connor's resilience was powerful. And that was when Zarek realized the truth. Connor Hart wasn't just surviving. He was fighting. He was fighting not only for his life, but for something bigger, something that Zarek couldn't quite grasp yet. But Zarek was determined to find out. Connor's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and calm. How long was I out? Zarek blinked, quickly gathering his thoughts. A few hours. You've healed faster than I expected. Connor gave a weak smile, though it was tinged with weariness. I guess I'm a fast healer. Zarek didn't reply immediately. His mind was still caught up in the anomaly before him. Human biology was supposed to be fragile, delicate. Yet Connor was proving the opposite. And just as Zarek was about to speak, an alarm blared suddenly, breaking the tension in the room. Zarek's eyes snapped to the screen. Something was wrong. Connor's readings had spiked in a way that wasn't normal. His body temperature had risen dramatically. Stay calm, Zarek said quickly, moving toward the panel. But inside, he was anything but calm. This was no ordinary recovery. Connor's body wasn't just healing, it was changing. As the alien nurse rushed to stabilize the readings, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed the beginning of something far greater than anything he had encountered before. What was happening to this human? And why was it happening so quickly? The answers would come soon, Zarek knew. But they would come at a cost. And in that moment, he couldn't help but wonder if Connor's miraculous recovery was merely the first of many shocks he would experience on this journey. Zarek's mind raced as he continued to study the human before him. Connor's wounds had healed almost completely in a matter of hours, something no living being should be capable of. The medical scanner still displayed data that didn't align with anything Zarek had ever encountered. In fact, it was so far beyond the alien's understanding that it almost seemed unnatural. He had treated countless patients from hundreds of different species, but none had ever displayed the level of recovery that Connor had shown. It was clear now that the cause of the rapid healing wasn't merely a quirk of human biology. It was something else, something Zarek could not yet comprehend. Where am I? Connor's voice broke through Zarek's thoughts, and the nurse snapped back into focus. You are aboard the Xenoship. You were injured during an intergalactic mission, Zarek replied carefully, though his mind was still spinning with the puzzle of Connor's miraculous recovery. I've been treating your wounds. Connor blinked, trying to sit up but wincing at the sudden motion. Zarek stepped forward, instinctively reaching out to help him, but Connor waved him off with a casual shrug. I'm fine, Connor said again, his tone more confident now than before. What's the damage? Zarek hesitated, then checked the medical readout one more time. It was pointless, really. Connor's body had healed faster than the scanner could analyze. But the nurse had to be sure. You've suffered significant burns and multiple lacerations, Zarek said, still unable to hide his disbelief. These injuries would have taken weeks to recover from under normal circumstances. But your body, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Connor smiled slightly, as though understanding what Zarek was thinking. Humans are pretty resilient, huh? Zarek didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on a small display embedded in the wall. It showed Connor's DNA sequence, completely normal for a human. No abnormalities. Nothing that would explain the speed of his healing. He hadn't ingested any healing compounds or been treated with advanced alien technology. There had been no intervention other than Zarek's care. Still, the results were clear. Something extraordinary was happening inside this human's body. I'm not sure what to make of this, Zarek said finally, his voice filled with quiet awe. You're recovering at a rate that no living being has ever displayed. Not even my own species can heal this quickly. Connor studied him for a moment before shrugging again, though this time he didn't seem as dismissive. It was as if he knew something Zarek didn't. I think it's more than just biology, Connor said, his voice softer now. It's more about how much you want to survive. Zarek tilted his head, intrigued. What do you mean? Connor paused for a long moment, then spoke in a slow, deliberate tone. When things get bad, you don't give up. You just keep going. You push through. I've had to do that my whole life, survive, no matter what. You can't let fear or pain stop you. Zarek's eyes narrowed as he absorbed Connor's words. There was an emotion behind them, something deeper than mere survival instinct. It was a quiet strength, a determination that transcended biology. It was as if Connor's very will to live was pushing his body to heal, faster than it should. Zarek had read about the human spirit, the way humans could overcome hardship and persevere against all odds, but he had never witnessed it firsthand. Not like this. What makes you so certain that's the reason? Zarek asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Connor glanced at the monitor behind Zarek, his eyes focusing for a moment before meeting the alien nurse's gaze again. Because I've been through a lot, he said quietly. I've lost people. I've seen things that would break anyone. But I didn't break. And I'm not about to now. Zarek felt a pang in his chest. He could sense the weight of Connor's words, the pain behind them. The human had suffered losses, endured trauma, but rather than crumbling, Connor had pushed through. And that, Zarek realized, was likely the key to this mystery. Perhaps your recovery is not solely a matter of your body, Zarek said thoughtfully. Perhaps your mind, your spirit, has a greater influence than I've considered. Connor didn't respond right away. He just stared at Zarek, and for a moment, the two of them shared an unspoken understanding. Zarek's years of study, his knowledge of alien biology, had never prepared him for this. The physical body was complex, yes, but perhaps there was something beyond it that Zarek had missed, the human soul, the power of will, the strength of belief. Just as Zarek was about to speak again, the alarms on the xenoship blared loudly, cutting through the quiet tension of the moment. Warning, external ship damage detected. Impact in 3 minutes. Zarek's head snapped toward the warning system. His heart raced. The ship had been under attack, and the debris from a nearby asteroid belt was rapidly approaching. The xenoship wasn't designed to withstand heavy impacts, and the damage was likely to be catastrophic. We need to evacuate, Zarek said immediately. He grabbed Connor's arm to help him up, but Connor pulled away with surprising strength. I'm fine, Connor repeated, this time with more urgency. Where do we go? We need to help the others. Zarek hesitated, then nodded. You're not fully healed. I can't. I'm fine, Connor cut him off, his eyes hard with determination. You need me. I'm not going to let this ship go down without doing everything I can. Zarek looked at him, stunned. He had never seen a being, human or otherwise, so determined to fight in the face of certain disaster. And that's when it hit him. Connor wasn't just surviving. He was driven by a force stronger than any alien biology could explain, a deep-rooted will to protect, to save, to keep fighting no matter the odds. Zarek knew that Connor's rapid healing wasn't just about biology. It was about spirit. And, for the first time, the alien nurse found himself feeling a deep respect for the human species. You're right, Zarek said quietly. We'll help the others together. And as the ship rocked under the impact of debris, Zarek realized that humanity's strength wasn't just in their ability to heal, it was in their unwavering will to live, to fight, and to never give up, no matter the cost. The alarms echoed throughout the medical bay, their shrill warning cutting through the calm of the room. Zarek's instincts kicked in immediately. His gaze darted to the large control panel mounted on the wall, which now displayed a series of flashing red lights and an ominous countdown. Warning, external ship damage detected. Impact in 3 minutes. Zarek's mind raced. The xenoship was equipped with the latest in defensive technology, shielding capable of repelling most forms of attack, but even the most advanced shields couldn't withstand every threat. And from the look of the alert, whatever was coming was powerful. Something outside the ship had caused a massive breach in the outer hull. The ship was in danger of losing its structural integrity. Zarek turned back to Connor, who had slowly risen to a sitting position on the bed. His eyes were wide, and his body still bore the evidence of the brutal injuries he had sustained, but now, the signs of rapid recovery were even more apparent. His face was less pale, his posture more confident. In a way, he seemed almost stronger. The human was already trying to stand, despite the fact that only hours ago, his injuries had been near fatal. Zarek rushed to his side, but Connor pushed him away gently, his determination palpable. "I'm fine," Connor said, though his voice had a tense edge now. "You've done your part. Now, let me do mine." Zarek was about to argue, to insist that Connor needed rest, but then he stopped. He'd watched as the human's wounds healed before his eyes. If there was anyone who might be able to help them get through this, it was Connor. His resilience wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and now, it seemed, even his spirit could help push him through unimaginable obstacles. Zarek helped steady Connor as he stood, his legs shaky but gaining strength with each passing second. As the countdown continued, the sound of distant explosions shook the entire ship, reverberating through the medical bay's walls. It was no longer a matter of if the ship would survive, it was a matter of how they would survive. "Let's move," Zarek said, his voice more urgent now. He led Connor toward the ship's control room, where the rest of the crew would be attempting to coordinate a defense. The corridors of the xenoship were chaotic as the crew rushed to their stations. Zarek moved quickly, glancing over at Connor, who was doing his best to keep pace. Despite his initial hesitation, Connor's determination seemed to drive him forward, each step more confident than the last. They reached the control room just as the ship lurched again from another violent explosion. The entire room was a flurry of motion. Alien engineers, military personnel, and other medical staff were all working feverishly at various stations. Holographic projections flickered across the walls, showing massive asteroid fields closing in on the ship, their path deadly and unavoidable. At the center of it all stood Captain Thera, a stoic and battle-hardened member of the ship's command staff. She turned to Zarek as he entered, her expression grim. "Status?" she asked sharply. Zarek quickly scanned the control panels. "We've lost outer shielding on Sector 7. A barrage of meteors is on course to breach the core if we don't redirect the ship immediately." Thera cursed under her breath. "Get us into evasive maneuvers. Now." The crew immediately responded, their hands flying over various controls, inputting commands to reroute power and adjust the ship's trajectory. But there was a problem. Some of the ship's engines had been damaged in the initial impact, and the evasive maneuvers required a full thrust to avoid the asteroid field. Without that, the ship would be sitting duck, an easy target for the barrage of space debris headed straight for them. Connor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You need someone to help with the engines. I've worked on Earth space stations. I can get us moving again." Zarek turned to look at him, his heart in his throat. "Connor, your body is still healing. You're not ready for something like that." But Connor's face was set with determination. "I may not be 100%, but I'm close enough. I won't let the ship fall apart because I'm not ready." Zarek wanted to argue, to insist that Connor needed more time, but something about the way the human stood, so sure of himself, silenced the protest. There was no stopping him now. He had the spirit of a fighter. Zarek nodded, stepping back to give him room. "Be careful," he said softly, almost as an afterthought. Connor moved quickly, his mind already racing through the schematics he had seen on the way to the control room. He wasn't sure how much his body had fully healed, but his mind was sharp, and his sense of urgency had sharpened since entering the chaos of the control room. He needed to act now. Zarek followed Connor as he made his way toward the ship's lower deck, where the damaged engines were located. As they moved through the corridors, Connor could feel his body straining with every step. His injuries were still raw, especially the burns on his arms and legs, but the more he focused on the task ahead, the less he felt the pain. There was only one thing that mattered now: getting this ship back in action. When they reached the engine room, Connor didn't waste a second. He climbed into the control panel, accessing the system with ease, despite his still wobbly hands. Zarek stood beside him, offering quiet assistance where needed, but there wasn't much time. The meteors were only minutes away from striking the core. Connor's mind raced through the technicalities of the ship's propulsion system. It wasn't much different from the engines on Earth's space stations, but it was far more advanced. Still, Connor was no rookie when it came to technology, and with each flick of a switch, he felt more confident in his abilities. Zarek watched him work, amazed by the human's resolve. It was almost as if Connor's recovery had been fueled by something far greater than biology, a burning desire to save those around him. It was clear that the human spirit was more powerful than Zarek had ever given it credit for. With a final adjustment, the engine system hummed to life. The ship groaned, but it began to shift its trajectory, narrowly avoiding the incoming barrage of meteors. Connor wiped the sweat from his brow, his exhaustion becoming evident. He was running on adrenaline, his body pushing through the limits of pain and fatigue. But they had done it. The ship was safe. Zarek stood at the entrance of the engine room, his eyes wide with admiration. Connor had done the impossible. "Good work," Zarek said quietly, though his words held more weight than any praise he had ever given. Connor, still catching his breath, nodded. "Thanks. Just another day in space." But as they both turned to walk back to the control room, Zarek couldn't help but think about what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just the technology or the ship that had saved them, it was the unshakable will of a human who refused to give up, no matter what. And for the first time, Zarek wondered, had he underestimated humanity all along? Connor's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit corridors of the Xenoship's lower deck, a place where the ship's heart, the engines, throbbed with the pulsing energy that powered everything aboard. Zarek was right behind him, his eyes scanning Connor's every move. Despite the human's insistence that he was fine, Zarek couldn't shake the feeling that pushing him into action this soon might be too much, even for someone as resilient as Connor. But Connor seemed determined, his jaw set with purpose. It was as if something inside him had clicked into place, a sense of responsibility and bravery that Zarek had seen in only the most battle-hardened soldiers. There was no time to question it. They reached the engine bay, where a handful of engineers were already working feverishly to reroute power and restore critical systems. The damage was clear, wires were exposed, sections of the walls had been torn apart by the impact, and sparks flew intermittently from the malfunctioning equipment. The smell of burnt metal and ozone filled the air. One of the engineers, a tall Zenthi with translucent blue skin, turned sharply as they entered. "Captain's orders, we're running a skeleton crew," she said, her voice a mixture of stress and urgency. "But the systems are overloaded. We need more than just rerouting power, we need manual intervention. If we don't engage the backup thrusters, we'll be smashed by the asteroid field." Connor scanned the room. His eyes immediately landed on the control panel at the far side of the room. The panels were littered with blinking red lights, showing a catastrophic loss of control over the ship's engines. It was clear that the damage was worse than he had anticipated, and the situation was more dire than it had seemed from the control room. But he had seen this kind of pressure before. Back home on Earth, working on space stations during emergencies like this was routine. "I can do this," he muttered to himself. "I've worked on thrusters. I know how to bypass the manual overrides." Zarek watched Connor, the quiet intensity in his movements. There was no sign of fear, no hesitation, just a single-minded determination. "Connor, you're still recovering," Zarek said again, though the words felt hollow this time. He could see the human's determination was unshakable. "I'm not worried about that right now," Connor replied with a brief glance back, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We're running out of time. You've got the medical part covered. I've got the engineering." Zarek took a step back, his heart heavy with a sense of helplessness. He didn't want to see this human push himself further than was necessary, but he also understood the reality of the situation. They were all in this together, and if Connor was willing to risk his body to save them all, then Zarek had no right to stop him. With a final, resigned nod, Zarek moved to assist the Zenthi engineer, who was attempting to fix a malfunctioning conduit. But his attention never strayed far from Connor. Connor was already working at the thruster control panel, his fingers flying over the switches and buttons. His body moved with purpose, as if every motion was choreographed in his mind. He could feel the faint ache in his muscles, but it was nothing compared to the sheer focus that consumed him. The ship was dying, and if he didn't get the engines back online in time, they would all be dead. He checked the power readouts. The primary thrusters were inoperable, likely due to damage to the main fuel lines. But the backup thrusters should still be functioning, at least, they had to be. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his hands moving faster. "Don't fail me now." There was a momentary flicker of doubt in his mind. Was he pushing his body too far? Too fast? Could he really hold it together long enough to get the job done? But then, something in him pushed those thoughts aside. He had no choice but to fight. His mind flashed to all the times in his life he had been backed into a corner, forced to survive against impossible odds. To keep going, to keep moving, even when every part of him screamed to stop. There was no stopping now. With a sharp breath, Connor connected a few wires, bypassing a damaged relay, and immediately felt the thrusters engage. The hum of the ship's power system surged as a series of secondary systems came to life. Thruster systems, online. Connor grinned despite the pain that shot through his body. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The backup thrusters would keep them on course, at least long enough to navigate the asteroid field. Suddenly, the entire ship lurched violently. The ground beneath Connor's feet shifted, and sparks flew from an exposed circuit as the ship was rocked by another violent explosion. The engineers scrambled to maintain control, but the ship was on the brink of falling apart. Zarek rushed over, his voice urgent. "Connor! You need to get out of here, the ship is destabilizing." But Connor barely heard him. His mind was already racing, calculating what was needed next. The backup thrusters had been activated, but they weren't enough to pull the ship out of the asteroid field's direct path. The ship was still on a collision course. "I'm not done yet," Connor said with determination, pushing forward despite the strain. He grabbed another tool from a nearby station and worked to adjust the ship's internal systems. The entire ship was a labyrinth of complicated systems, but Connor knew it like the back of his hand. He had worked on similar models back on Earth. As the countdown continued in the background, only moments away from impact, Connor knew they had one final chance. The Xenoship needed more than just a brief course correction. It needed a miracle. But if there was one thing Connor had learned over the years, it was that miracles didn't happen on their own. They were made, through sheer will, through determination, through a refusal to give up. Connor turned to Zarek, his eyes locked with the alien nurses. "Tell the captain. I've got it." Zarek hesitated for a brief moment, uncertainty clouding his features, but then nodded. "I'll notify her." Be careful. Connor didn't respond, already turning back to the ship's systems. The human spirit, the resilience that had allowed him to heal so quickly, was now fueling his mind and body. And as the seconds ticked down, Connor knew one thing with certainty: he wasn't going to let this ship fall. Not on his watch. The countdown hit 30 seconds, and Connor pulled the final lever. The ship shuddered as its engines roared back to life, just in time. The ship's violent lurch sent Connor tumbling toward the console, barely catching himself on the edge of a panel. His body screamed with pain, but he ignored it. The backup thrusters were holding steady for now, but that wouldn't last long if the ship continued to take hits. They were running out of time. Zarek's voice rang out behind him. "Connor! Get away from there. The ship can't take much more of this." Connor shook his head, gritting his teeth as he pushed himself up from the floor. Every fiber of his being ached, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. If he didn't keep working, the ship would soon break apart entirely. He couldn't let that happen. He turned to Zarek, his eyes meeting the alien nurse's concerned gaze. "I'm fine," he rasped, his voice strained but firm. "But we need to get those primary thrusters back online, or we'll be sitting ducks." Zarek hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between concern for Connor's well-being and the knowledge that the humans' tenacity was their best chance. He nodded silently and moved to assist the engineers who were still working on other parts of the ship's systems. Connor's hands flew over the control panel again, quickly running diagnostic checks on the main thrusters. Sparks continued to fly from the damaged conduits, the sound of the explosions echoing in the distance as the ship's hull groaned under the pressure. The countdown was ticking down, closer and closer to catastrophe. Every second felt like a lifetime. He scanned the readouts, eyes narrowing. The primary thrusters were indeed offline, and the core engine had sustained irreparable damage. The only way to get them moving again was to manually reroute the power, something that would take time, and a steady hand. If he made one wrong move, they'd lose whatever little control they had left. "You're not alone," Zarek's voice interrupted his thoughts. The alien had approached quietly, standing beside Connor now, ready to help however he could. Connor gave a quick nod, grateful for the presence of the nurse. "I'll need you to monitor the energy flow and make sure nothing's overloaded. If anything spikes, we won't be able to stop it. It'll rip the ship apart." Zarek nodded and set to work, his sharp eyes scanning the power grid and diagnostic reports as Connor continued working on the thrusters. The tension in the room was palpable. Outside, the asteroid field loomed, and the sound of the ship's hull taking damage grew louder with each passing moment. The countdown clock was now in its final minute. The engineers were still scrambling to fix other critical systems, but Connor's focus never wavered. He had no room for fear, no room for doubt. The only thing that mattered was getting the ship back on course. The energy coursed through his hands as he rerouted power, his fingers flying over the damaged panel with precision and determination. Sweat dripped down his face, his body feeling as if it were on the edge of collapse, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Just one more," his eyes locked on a final sequence of switches. He knew this was the make-or-break moment. With a deep breath, Connor flipped the last switch. There was a split-second silence, a terrifying moment when nothing seemed to happen, when the ship seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sudden surge, the primary thrusters roared to life. A low, thunderous hum filled the room, and the entire ship shook as the engines powered up. "Thrusters are online," Zarek shouted, his voice full of relief. Connor grinned, wiping the sweat from his brow. The ship was moving again, pulling away from the asteroid field with a new surge of momentum. The countdown clock flickered, and the ship's defensive systems began to engage, firing off bursts of energy that knocked some of the remaining asteroids off course. The xenoship was out of immediate danger. The field had been navigated. But even as the ship stabilized, Connor couldn't fully relax. His body was on the brink of exhaustion, his muscles aching from the effort. Every part of him felt as though it were on fire. He stumbled slightly as he stood, his hands trembling. His vision blurred for a moment, and he felt a rush of dizziness. Zarek, who had been monitoring the ship's systems, immediately noticed Connor's unsteady gait. "Connor." The alien nurse moved toward him, his concern evident. "You've pushed yourself too far. You need rest." Connor shook his head, his voice strained but determined. We made it. That's what matters." Zarek caught him before he could collapse, gently guiding him back to the medical bay. The ship had been saved, but at a cost. Connor had given everything, his body, his spirit, and now, he needed to recover. As Zarek helped Connor back to the medical bed, the human's exhaustion was palpable. He didn't resist, his body was too worn down to fight. He allowed himself to sink into the bed, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "You're right," Connor said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I need to rest." Zarek made sure Connor was comfortable, adjusting the blankets and preparing a medical infusion to help accelerate his recovery. The human's body had already healed at an incredible rate, but even now, Zarek could see the toll it had taken. Connor was resilient, yes, but even he had limits. As the nurse worked, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had just transpired. He had witnessed something truly remarkable. A human, against all odds, had faced near death and the destruction of an entire ship and had still found a way to keep going. It was as if Connor's spirit, his sheer will to survive, had become an unstoppable force. Zarek had seen countless species fight for survival, but none like this. The human spirit, Zarek realized, was far more powerful than any technology, any healing process, or any alien biology. It was a force that no machine could replicate. Connor's eyes fluttered closed as the healing infusion began to work its magic, and Zarek stood silently beside him, his thoughts deep in reflection. There was still so much to learn about humanity, but for the first time, Zarek felt like he had glimpsed the very essence of what made humans so extraordinary. And he was certain of one thing: whatever came next, this crew would not go down without a fight. They had a secret weapon that no one could predict, no one could understand. The resilience of the human heart. As the ship's alarms quieted and the hum of the engine steadied, Zarek allowed himself a moment of peace. The danger was over, for now. But the true lesson had just begun. A lesson in strength. A lesson in survival. A lesson that transcended biology. Connor was barely aware of the world around him as Zarek guided him back to the medical bay. His vision swam, and his legs felt like lead. The moments of triumph, the victory of saving the ship, were fading in the wake of an overwhelming exhaustion. His body was on the edge of collapse, and yet, all he could think of was the ship, the crew, the people who had depended on him. He had given everything. And now, he had nothing left to give. The bed was soft, but it felt like 1,000 tons pressing down on him. Zarek's gentle touch on his shoulder was the only thing that grounded him as the world spun. "You've done enough," Zarek said quietly, his voice filled with a rare tenderness. "Now, you need to rest. You need to heal." Connor wanted to argue, to push past the weakness creeping into his limbs, but his body refused to cooperate. His mind was still sharp, but his physical form was crumbling under the weight of everything he had just endured. He tried to focus, to find the energy to sit up, but each breath felt heavier than the last. "Rest," Zarek repeated, his hand pressing against Connor's chest as he eased him back down. "I'll stay here with you. You're not alone." The simple reassurance hit Connor harder than expected. He hadn't realized how much he needed it. After everything, after the pain, the battle, the exhaustion, it felt like a lifeline. The ship was safe. The crew was safe. But for the first time since the explosion, Connor allowed himself to feel the weight of it all, the toll it had taken on his body, his mind, and his spirit. Hours passed, though Connor had no real sense of time. He drifted in and out of sleep, the steady hum of the ship's engines lulling him into a sense of peace. In the quiet moments, he reflected on the events that had brought him here, the chaos, the uncertainty, the sheer willpower it had taken to keep pushing forward. And then, slowly, the feeling of healing began to creep back into his limbs. His body still ached, but the worst of the pain was subsiding. His heart slowed, his breathing deepened, and he felt, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, that he was truly safe. But safety had its own weight. It was not just a physical state, it was an emotional one. He had survived. They had survived. But at what cost? Zarek sat beside him, his expression calm but watchful. He had not left Connor's side since the moment he'd collapsed. The alien's presence was a comfort, yet Connor couldn't help but feel like he was burdening him. "I didn't think I was going to make it," Connor admitted quietly, his voice hoarse. I thought I'd let you down." Zarek's eyes softened as he met Connor's gaze. "You haven't let anyone down. You've done more than any of us could have hoped for." The words didn't fully heal the guilt that tugged at Connor's heart, but they eased it. He had always carried the burden of responsibility. It was something ingrained in him, from the day he'd stepped onto the first space station back on Earth. He had always been the one who had to do the impossible. But this had been different. This had been more than he had ever signed up for. The quiet of the medical bay was broken by a soft chime as a message arrived on the communications panel. Zarek glanced at the screen before turning back to Connor. "It's from the command deck," Zarek said. "They're requesting you for a debrief." Connor groaned, feeling a wave of fatigue wash over him again. "Can't they just let me rest a little longer?" he muttered. Zarek chuckled softly. "You've earned your rest. But there are still questions to be answered." Connor knew that Zarek was right. The mission wasn't over. The ship was safe, but there were still repairs to be made, systems to check, and, most importantly, answers to be found. The question of what had attacked them, of why the asteroid field had been so precisely positioned, hung over everything like a dark cloud. "Okay," Connor said, slowly pushing himself up. His body protested every movement, but he forced himself to sit up straight. "Let's get this over with." They made their way to the command deck, where Captain Thera and the rest of the command crew awaited. The room was quiet, the tension still palpable in the air. Thera stood at the center, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze steady but laced with concern. "Connor," she said as they entered, her voice a mixture of relief and something else, perhaps gratitude. "We've all been waiting for you." Connor nodded, still feeling the weight of his exhaustion in his bones. "I assume you figured out what happened?" Thera glanced at the data streaming across the control panels. "We've identified the source of the attack, but it's not what we expected. The asteroid field was no natural occurrence. It was deliberately placed there, targeting our exact location." The room fell silent, the implication of her words sinking in. Someone had planned this attack. And someone had known exactly where the xenoship would be. Connor felt a chill run down his spine. "So, we were deliberately ambushed?" Thera nodded grimly. "Yes. And that means there's something, or someone, out there who is watching us." The realization hit like a punch to the gut. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were now part of something much larger, something dangerous. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The beginning of a hunt. But in that moment, as the crew stared at each other, the weight of the unknown pressing on them, Connor realized something profound. He wasn't the only one who had survived this trial. They had all survived it together. And together, they could face whatever came next. Zarek stepped closer to Connor, his voice quiet but resolute. You've proven what humanity is capable of today. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. Connor nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. The weight of the unknown was still heavy, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying it alone. The ship was far from safe. But humanity had shown that it could endure. And as long as they stuck together, as long as they kept fighting, they could overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. The sterile glow of the medical bay felt strangely comforting now. The cold metal beneath Connor's back had once felt foreign and intimidating, but after everything that had happened, it now felt like a strange haven. Zarek stood over him, his tentacled arms hovering over the human in careful observation. The alien nurse's face, typically an expressionless mask, betrayed a rare flicker of awe. Connor's heart slowed to a steady rhythm as he took in his surroundings, his body having almost completely healed. The burn marks, deep gashes, and bruises that had once marred his skin were gone, leaving only faint traces of memory. But it wasn't just the physical healing that baffled Zarek, it was the speed, the profound depth of it all. "I don't understand," Zarek murmured, his voice a mix of fascination and disbelief. "What happened? You should have been incapacitated for weeks, months, even, yet you're standing here in mere hours. And it's not just physical. There's something else, something inside you." Connor, still dazed but with a flicker of clarity in his eyes, sat up. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of what he had just experienced. The battle on the alien planet, the struggle to save Zarek's crew, and the impossible escape from certain death had all been part of the reason for his miraculous recovery. But there was something deeper that Zarek wasn't aware of. "I don't know how to explain it," Connor said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Back there, when everything seemed lost, I didn't have time to think. I just acted. I didn't give up. I couldn't. Maybe that's what made the difference." Zarek tilted his head in confusion. "You act as though your recovery is tied to something internal. But why? What is it about your species that—" "It's not about biology," Connor interrupted gently. "It's about willpower, about belief. Humans, we don't give up easily. We fight when it seems impossible. And when we do, when we push through the darkest parts of ourselves, sometimes, we find something greater than just survival. We find strength." Zarek was silent for a long moment. His multiple eyes blinked slowly as he processed the words. It wasn't just the resilience Connor had shown that was extraordinary, it was the unfathomable strength of the human spirit. He had read about human endurance in the records, but seeing it firsthand was something entirely different. "Your species is more powerful than any medicine or technology," Zarek said, his voice thick with newfound respect. "It is not your body that heals so quickly, but your mind. Your heart." Connor smiled faintly, despite the exhaustion still pulling at him. "We don't need magic, Zarek. Just a little bit of hope, and the will to keep going, no matter what."